So another important consideration when you're designing your perennial garden is choosing the right plants. And if the plant isn't happy where it is, you're not going to be happy either. So once you've got your site in that, there's a couple things to consider. You've got the plant for the right sunlight conditions, but we need to be starting to look at choosing a variety of color. And I find that's what most people, where they go wrong, is they choose something because the flower attracted them, but when things aren't in bloom, is the plant still adding anything to your garden or not? So we're just going to talk for a minute about choosing the right, choosing plants with a variety of colors. And when we're talking about colors, we're just not talking about flower colors. We're also talking about foliage color, which to me is even more important in the garden. Because if you think of, if you cut a time in your perennial garden when there's nothing in bloom, you still want there to be the interest there. So foliage color too is very important. If you go to opposite colors on the color wheel, it's going to add more contrast in your garden. So when you think of opposites, you think of a lot of your holiday colors. Purples and yellows, think of Easter. Orange and blues are opposites. Reds and greens are opposite on there. But all of a sudden, if you had everything that was green leaf together, you would start losing some of the interest. But all of a sudden, you put something like this Angelina sedum, which has a nice lime yellow, beside a red, you get that really nice contrast. So plants are going to show up nicely against each other. Where if everything you had was green leaf, everything will just start look wishy-washy in there. So that's why we talk about looking for color. Also, according to your theme, think about what colors. If you want a nice quiet garden, you would go into more your cool colors. Your pinks, whites, mauves, purples, and those are what we refer to cool colors. And cool colors recede. They have a way of making a space feel larger, but they also have a very calming effect. If you're that party animal and you just need color in your garden, usually you're looking more at your golds, oranges, reds, burgundies. And those colors come at you, and they actually give you more life. Think of McDonald's and how they chose their colors. They didn't go into the pale purples and mauves and pinks, but they have all those rusts and orange and yellows and golds. And that's because those colors create excitement. So maybe you have a pool area, maybe you invite a lot of people over, you're kind of the host of the neighborhood. You might want those vibrant colors to make the place seem more alive. So that's when you would choose those oranges and golds and reds. If you have a little corner with a bench and you just want a kind of a cool, relaxing spot where you can go read a book or that, you might want to consider using more your paler colors. So those pinks and whites and mauves. So if you pick colors that are adjacent to each other, we talked about colors opposite each other, provides contrast. If you pick those colors adjacent to each other, say like this Virginia is a nice light pink, maybe you're adding a darker pink with it. This is a dwarf bleeding hearts. And if you pick all different shades of pinks and whites, they're more subdued. So think about your style again, and what kind of feeling are you wanting your garden to create. If you have a lot of bright yellows in that, it might not be that cool, calming spot that you want it to be. So color plays a very important part into gardening. And make sure that you get different foliage colors as well. We talked about the sedums and that. The last few years, the coral bells have become very popular as well. And the flower's still interesting. This gets a nice little pink stalk of flowers onto it, but it's more for the foliage. Or you think of the hostas with the bright yellow leaves or variegated leaves. Even stuff like the variegated Iconocloa grass has that nice yellow and green leaf, where there's a straight gold one as well. And that just adds a lot of color into it. So again, if you have a lot of mixtures of greens, you need that color contrast just for the plants to stand out against one another. So if you find you're looking at your garden and you're always you just kind of see greenery, and if things are in between bloom, we always have those early spring bloomers. By the end of June, we're kind of dying out on the flowers. You still want that color in the garden, and the foliage color is going to give that to you. So when you're looking for a perennial, don't always just look at the flower and think, oh, isn't that nice? But think, well, is that going to give me color afterwards? Something as simple as an iris that has a nice purple flower and that you might be attracted to. There's nice variegated forms of iris. And so even after it gets a lovely fragrant purple flower onto it, when it's done bloom, it's still adding beauty into there. So you can still be using some of your old favorites in the garden, but just look at new varieties that might offer that contrast for you. But I find that's where most people go wrong with perennial garden, is just that they don't have color contrast, that everything is green. We talked about grouping plants together, so even doing a larger grouping of more colorful foliage will make more of an impact for you. And Yeah, make sure that you're incorporating that into your garden, but don't just be looking at the flowers. The flowers are important, and more importantly is the foliage. So make sure you're including that. But remember, nothing in nature clashes. There's no color combination that won't work. Reds and purples are beautiful in a garden together. Different colors, so you don't have to just have pinks, whites, and purples and that. But be thinking of your theme. Be thinking of what kind of feeling you want to create with your garden. Do you want it to be that nice, relaxing place where you just sit and meditate and meet with people, or do you want that vibrant life going on in your garden? And again, we talked about whether you're viewing the garden from a distance or up close. If you have a faraway corner, if all you had was pale greens and that in that corner, it's just going to be lost in the landscape. But all of a sudden, if you add a punch of yellow or a punch of burgundy into that garden, that's going to be more visible from a distance. So again, just the importance of adding color into there. If it was a dark corner and all you have is dark colored leaves, maybe it's underneath a maple tree and it's really shady. If all you had was green leaf hostas, it's going to make that area look more dark. But if you had stuff like the grasses or a nice white and green hosta or gold hosta added into there, all of a sudden you're brightening up that area and giving it new life as well. So be looking at your different areas. What do you need? Do you need something dark under there? Do you need to brighten that area up? But make sure you have the different contrasts of colors in your garden. So we just talked about choosing a variety of different colors in the garden to make it exciting. Another thing we have to look at is getting a variety of different shapes. And by shapes, we're looking at both flowers, we're looking at leaf shape, and also the plant shape overall. Something like this dwarf bleeding heart that loves a shady spot is a very fine texture, but very frilly, just little flowers coming up. If all the flowers in our garden were that small, there wouldn't be any contrast. But as soon as you put it with something like the yellow daffodils here, you can see a different flower shape. Will definitely make a contrast in the garden. As I said before, if everything's a daisy or a spike flower, then you're going to get bored with your garden. So we have to consider the flower shapes that you're adding. You want some spike flowers, whether it's like salvia, Russian sage, in there, some daisy type flowers, some smaller frilly flowers, and just get a variety of different shapes of flowers themselves. But also we want to look at different leaves in that. Again, to use this dwarf bleeding heart right here, being a smaller leaf, to put something like the hens and chicks beside it that has quite a coarse leaf makes a nice contrast. And without those different leaf shapes, again, if everything was the same leaf shape, your garden would just be a mishmash and your eye would just kind of scan over it quickly, but not really pick up on anything. So maybe it's doing something with a spiked leaf, like this variegated iris, along with more of a frilly type of leaf, and then adding something kind of medium texture in with that is going to create a lot more interest to you. So not just flower shape, but also leaf shape. And then we also talk about the plant shape. If you think of a shade garden and we have the hostas and that into there, and they're quite a mounding form to them, all of a sudden if we add like the purple coral bells in with it, it's also a very mounding form. And even though there'd be a contrast in colors in that, it's not going to give you a lot of interest as far as that goes. So again, you want something maybe more spiky like a fern, or like the golden Hiconocloa grass at the front of this display that's more spiky as well and cascades over. So you also want a variety of shapes of forms in the garden. And it makes the world a difference all of a sudden when you have a combination. I love coming out here just with a card or something, and some days when I'm designing kind of stuck, it's just putting combinations of plants together on your cart. And I find that's a great way when you're shopping, is put a bunch of plants down together. Sometimes we look at the whole perennial garden, we get overwhelmed because you're thinking about, I need different bloom times, I need different shapes, I need different colors. And altogether that can be quite overwhelming. But all of a sudden, if on your cart, all of a sudden you collect maybe 5 plants that look great together, then move on to the next set of 5 plants. And if those plants look great, then you get through your garden. But if you're looking at a grouping of plant material, we talked about variety of color, varieties of shape. And the other one's variety of textures, which we've been talking about as well, with frilly and larger leaf. If you can set together some plants and ask yourself, do I have some leaf color in this combination of 5 or 7 plants? Do I have contrast of forms? Do I have the colors I want? Is there something spring blooming, summer blooming? Do I have some fall interest or winter interest in there? And if you break your garden down into smaller areas and say, you know, does that look pleasing on its own? Do I have all those items in the garden? Then it's going to be a very pleasing garden. You'll tend to go to the colors you want to anyway. Your eye will automatically, if you're a pinks and whites and purples person, you'll be picking those plants automatically out on the benches. But the biggest mistake we make when we come in the spring and we're so excited about buying plants is then we'll just be buying plants that are in bloom because we like the flowers. But be asking those questions. Is there leaf color? Do I have different textures? Do I have different bloom times on there? But to think about it as a whole 40, 50-foot garden can overwhelm you. So when doing a larger garden, just think of it in smaller parcels and get a set of flowers. So we don't have anything too spiky here yet. So maybe we're adding something that has a bit more spikiness to it. Maybe we find we just don't have enough leaf color there. And so we want to add in something like a variegated iris or that's just going to add that different texture. But as long as you keep picking out just smaller areas, you'll find overall that your likes in that will come through and you'll just automatically pick things that you like and they will work all together. But always be asking yourself, do I have that contrast of flower, color, leaf, form? Do I have color contrast? Do I have different seasons of interest? And one of the best things you can do is when you come, if your garden is kind of in between bloom times, you have all those spring blooming perennials, your peony, your poppies, your irises are all out. But then later in the season, in June, July, you're kind of going through a bit of a dry period as far as flowers go. It's a great time to come into the garden center, walk around and see what is in bloom at that time that you can be adding to your garden so that you're kind of filling in those missing times. Again, in the fall, we have all the cone flowers, the rudbeckias, the sedums in bloom. So I find it's at June, July time that's one of the hardest. But a lot of perennials are blooming at that time. So if you find you have that dull spot, just make sure that you're coming and looking around or spotting things in other gardens that might be in bloom that you can add to your garden as well. Pick plants that look, as we said, both good in bloom and out of bloom. So again, it's looking at that foliage. Nothing more beautiful than a peony in bloom, but when it's done, the foliage isn't that interesting. And so is there something else that you could be adding in with the peony that's going to give interest later on in the season and maybe some colored foliage with it to break up all that greenery. Choose plants that are more disease resistant. So if you love the bee balm, the monarda, native plant that attracts hummingbirds and great to have in the garden. Some of the older varieties get a lot of mildew and some different problems. You lose some lower leaves on it. But there's so many new varieties that are more resistant to diseases. And some of them, even with the monarda, there's some dwarf varieties. So if you don't want a 2-3 foot monarda in the garden, there's some that only get 6-10 inches high and repeat bloom. So look for newer varieties that still offer you all those old-fashioned things that you're in love with, but maybe in more colorful foliage or a repeat blooming. Even in the Shasta daisies, there's some nice dwarf varieties now that repeat bloom during the summer. There's one called Snowcap. So it's going to give you more interest in the garden. So be checking out those different seasons and those different varieties and make sure that you got kind of the best one out. Make sure you're grouping your plants together all with the same requirements. As we said, when you're analyzing your sites, you want to make sure that if you have a sunny area, that all your plants can tolerate sun. And also think of the dryness. If you group some plants together that like it really moist, say like a ligularia, and you're grouping with something that prefers a dry soil, you can't keep both of them happy in the same garden, or you have to do a lot of individual watering. So if you know you have a dry area, make sure you're putting all the plants, all the succulents, the sedums, hens and chicks, lavenders, plants like that together that have all those same requirements. And it's going to lower your maintenance. You can target those areas that needed more wets and then lay back on the ones that like a drier soil. Some other helpful hints is avoid overcrowding. When we first put perennials in, they're nice and small, and so we put them fairly close together in the garden. But if you've ever had black-eyed Susan, you realize that one little plant in the 4-inch pot soon becomes a big grouping. So kind of read up on the tag, ask questions when you come in, And usually they'll say how far apart to space the plants. And don't be too quick to place things closer together. You'll be weeding it out quickly. I know it's nice to have a nice full garden to begin with, but you'll find you're just ripping those plants out in the future. So just don't fall into the trap of overcrowding your plants, or you'll be doing a lot of dividing in the future. You can be even incorporating, we've got some nice bulbs here in bloom, some tulips and daffodils, and you even incorporate those into your perennial garden. They're up and going before most perennials are even showing, and it's a way of just getting an earlier start on the season to get blooms 2-3 weeks earlier in your garden that you normally would. One of the combinations I love to see is the giant alliums with the large purple globe flowers in with a patch of the golden Hiconocloa grass there. And it just makes a really nice combination. It has a real elegant look to it. But the grass is just starting to come up when it's in bloom and showing color, so you get that yellow-purple contrast. But once the allium's done, then the grass is filled out for the season. And so again, just giving more interest to that one space. We had talked about in larger gardens, when viewing gardens from a distance, make sure you're doing larger groupings. If your house is set back 80 feet from the road and you're doing 3 of this and 1 of this, it's not going to have any effect from the road, and that's where people are mainly seeing that bed from. So again, consider the size of bed you have, and your groupings should reflect. The larger the bed, the larger the groupings need to be. And if you have plants that grow large, like delphiniums and canthus and peonies, you might not need 11 of them in a grouping. You might only need 5, but the plants that are going to be much smaller growing, you'll have to do larger quantities just to have a balanced look in the garden. So when you're grouping, make sure that you don't just do 1 of this, 1 of that. To get out effect, you need to do them in larger groupings. Don't forget adding that winter interest into your garden. And there's many plants that have attractive seed heads on, attracts the birds for the winter months, like the coneflowers, the rudbeckias. Even Russian sage has these nice silver stems in the winter with the dried seed heads on top. And it's a way of just getting interest. It's nice to look out on a snowy day and see the snow sitting on different plants, like your autumn joy sedum and that. So there is ways of adding winter interest. Even the tall ornamental grasses, how they'll sway and kind of rattle when they're dry in the winter months, adds that interest. But sometimes in the perennial gardens, if it's all perennials, you do need to add a little bit of structure in there as well. So it might be adding like a nice obelisk, those wooden structures that you can grow a vine up on. We'll just add interest in the winter garden as well as the summer garden. Maybe it's adding the bird bath and that sort of thing into the garden as well, just to give it some structure. If you look at old English perennial gardens, quite often they had large evergreens, so it might just be like a pyramid yew or a pyramid boxwood growing in with some perennials or a grouping of dense evergreens. And again, that's just a way of giving the bed some structure to break up if your garden's looking wish-washy. It just breaks up the texture and gives you something else, kind of a focal point in the garden. And we'll add some winter interest in there as well. So there's a lot that you can be doing to make your perennial garden go throughout 4 seasons instead of just the 3. We're going to show you a picture on the screen, and it shows a possible combination. We'll have some of them to come up. But say you had a shade garden and you're thinking of different leaf shapes. You'll see in the background we have what they call a chocolate cimicifuga or bugbane, and a nice dark burgundy kind of ferny leaf with nice whitish pink spiked flowers late summer. In front of it I've put in Alexander the Great Brunera, or bug loss, and it has that large heart-shaped leaf, so it's giving a much coarser texture than the bugbane, and it has the silver with the green veining in it as well. So we've got a burgundy, we've already got a larger texture with different leaf color. In front of the Alexander the Great Brunera, you'll see some, it's called Chinese ginger. And what I've done is picked up on the silver and green that's in the Brunera, the large heart-shaped leaf one, and in front did a low ground cover, and it's green with a silver in it. So we're kind of picking up on the same colors of leaf, but it's adding a bit smaller leaf size to it, so added contrast that way, but still kind of picking up on some of the colors. We've also put into there some at the front, a low ground cover called pink pewter lamium. And again, we're playing with that silver and white and adding in a pink flower. Again, it's more for the foliage than actually the flower, although most of those plants do flower. And the last flower that I placed in that combination is the dwarf bleeding heart that we've been talking about. And it's a very fine frilly foliage. So we've got more of a fern type of foliage with spiked flowers. We have a large heart-shaped leaf that will get nice little blue forget-me-not flowers first thing in the spring. We've got the ginger that has more of that leaf color, and a low ground cover that will bloom sporadically throughout the summer. So really played up on that silver-green combination, repeated it in different textures, which can make a nice combination, and just did the accent with Simicifuga in the background to get that large spiky type of effect. So some in a shade garden, a lot of people say you can't get the color in the shade, all we have is hostas. But there's so many more plants out there for a shady spot that can give you interest. You might not get as long of blooming, but the leaf textures and that become very important in that type of garden. So next you'll see an example of doing more of that lineal planting and just having the flowers kind of follow the bed shape. So we've done more curved groupings of perennials. So started with a low sedum in front. This is for a hot, sunny, dry spot. So a low sedum called cherry tart that has a nice bright burgundy red leaf to it. We'll get a pink flower in the fall, but just kind of that nice rubbery texture to the leaf. And behind it we've done some nice lavender. So I have more of a silver foliage with the purple spiked flowers on late spring, early summer. And in behind that, put in some yellow daylilies. Wanted more of a spiky type leaf. So far we had a low mounding plant. The lavender is very fine, so just wanted a larger spiky leaf to it. So put in some yellow daylilies that will repeat bloom during the summer. And it's also a good example of using the yellow and the purple as a sharp contrast, and how it will stand out into the garden and give you more life. But there should be color, even if that doesn't bloom, there's still color and interest in that garden, and we're not just relying on the flowers to give that to us. It's often said that perennial gardens are low maintenance, and there is some plants that will definitely be lower maintenance than others for you, but all gardens do require a little bit of work. If you can be deadheading flowers, especially if they're more of a spring bloomer, it will help them repeat bloom during the summer later on. You might just have to be taking a few leaves off, keeping a watch on your perennials for any insect problems, and making sure you're getting ahead of them before they become a major problem in your garden. So there's always a little bit of effort. Perennials too, with them blooming in that, it's always best to be feeding them in the spring just as they're starting to grow. And for most of your flowering perennials, you want to go something higher in the middle number, higher in phosphorus. So something like even our transplant starter, which is great for a new garden, also is high in phosphorus and good for anything in bloom. So feeding them even first thing in the spring and then about 6 weeks later with a second application of fertilizer will just keep them healthy for the season to lower that maintenance, so you're not having to deal with different insect and disease problems with them. So it can be a lower form of maintenance, but there's always a little bit of work to do. But hopefully that's some pointers that will help you, and when you first start shopping, hopefully we'll be getting a lot more perennials in shortly, and we also have a great selection here. But don't be afraid to grab a cart and just start making groupings on your carts and play with colors, and that's usually we have the sun perennials all on one side, shade on the other. So as long as we know what sun conditions you have, we can direct you to the right plants. But play around with the combinations, try something different. Look for the different leaf colors even if they don't provide you with a flower. That's going to make all the difference in your perennial gardens. As we were saying, we all should start with a plan, and if you're planning a perennial garden, it is a great tool to sit down and draw it out. We've put on our website a landscape planning guide, and it's an ebook that you can download, and it will lead you through some of the questions to think about, but it also will show you how to kind of draw it out so that you can be thinking about where should I put color, where do I need summer interest, where do I need fall interest. And even just doing quick blobs on the paper will help you to think it through before you come to the garden centers. And it's just a great tool that we have to help you lead you through that process.